Welcome to the Mariners Museum and Park. My name is Lauren T. Fury, and I'm with the Department of Interpretation, and I'm in charge of visitor engagement here at the museum. And just to let you know, this kind of this idea started last summer when we were back working, when we were working from home, not in the museum. And we kind of started looking around more in the collection and came across some questions. So that's kind of where we're starting from with this program. Now, let me show you this. Everything we do is tied to the mission here at the Mariners Museum, and this is my very favorite Thomas Skinner painting. These paintings, if you've ever had the opportunity to see them in person, are very large. They're about 10 feet by 6 feet. And we had an exhibit several years ago called Building Better Ships, which was tied to the shipyard, and many of these paintings were on display. So as you can see with our mission statement, that we connect people to the world's waters, and it's through that shared maritime heritage that we're all connected to one another. And if you think, well, I don't live near the water, I don't live near a lake, I don't live near a river, nothing, everything you have in your home can be tied to the water. Many things come from overseas and cargo ships, so really we're all connected through that waterway. Now, I'm starting out with one of my very favorite images that I've used several times in other programs, programs about our bronze doors, but this is Mr. Fisher. And I want to explain the hidden histories a little bit. So the project will give names and agency and interpretation to those unidentified people in our collection who are Black. We have many photos that we don't know who these people actually are. And we're trying to give a full and complete history of our shared maritime heritage. And this is the way to do it, is to really dive in and explore all of these images. This will hopefully also expand our knowledge and the richness of our local history in our community, because many of these families quite possibly could still be living in this area. So we're really hoping that the community can help us with this. But this wonderful picture of Mr. Fisher, we do know who he was. He was actually a chauffeur with a shipyard car. This was a car that rode between the shipyard and the Mariners Museum, carrying mail, and also every morning carrying mail, and also mail to the hydraulic lab, which is where the Peninsula Fine Arts Center, well, the former Peninsula Fine Arts Center is located. That was one of the shipyard's labs there. And also passengers back and forth from the shipyard to the museum and back again. Several employees worked in both areas. So I've used this image a lot of times, and I just love this image very much. So I'm starting my program with this one, which is someone we actually know a little bit about. And then we came across a bunch of photos that are actually part of the corporate archives. So they're not actually in the collection per se. So we started looking through these, and we were like, well, these are a lot of guys working. Who are they? We don't know who all of them are. And so there's several in a row here that I want to share with you. These are all from 1935, and they are the exterior museum buildings and the construction of the main hall, or the Great Hall. They're pouring footings. The first library section is coming into getting built in these images. And they're all from June to September of 1935. So very, very specific time period. So I want to show you this one. You can see them all working. This is another great shot. You can see the guy in the middle who's kind of looking directly at the camera, this gentleman right here. More workers back here. Kind of a hard way to identify since they're bent over and their backsides are facing us. And then again, a great truck image as well, but you can see the folks working on the construction and the brickwork. Again, pouring concrete, mixing concrete and mortar for all the brickwork. As you know, the Mariners Museum has a lot of brickwork that's done, and I'll talk about that technique in just a minute. And here's another image of the walls going up in one of the larger doorways as well. And this is an image of the, it's tagged as the Great Hall, which these are the roof trusses going in, which is kind of cool to see. You know, and when you think about it, you only see about, I think at the most like 10 guys working, and that's a lot of work getting done by a small number of people. Now I wanted to find this. Now I will tell you that this is a table I pulled off of a dissertation about Swantown, which if you know about Newport News, Swantown was one of the first um, Black neighborhoods that was built in Newport News in about started in 1935, and it's now where Main Street tees against Jefferson Avenue, those houses back in that area. I actually own a house that was originally built for Black shipyard workers on Main Street. So there's not a whole lot of information about Swantown. That was very briefly for Black shipyard workers before the city evicted all of them, and Aberdeen Gardens neighborhood was built. So, but I wanted to show you this population chart showing you the percentages at the time period. So the Mariners Museum is founded in 1930. A lot of that construction is going on in the 1930s to then about 1936 or so. So it's really interesting to see the population at that time in this area. So we would have had folks working at the shipyard and at the Mariners Museum. Now this was the golden photo. I mean, that's kind of how I call it. This was the photo where we all looked at it and we thought, wow, who are these guys? This is an awesome photo of the African-American workers who built the Mariners Museum. There's a second photo that goes along with this of the white supervisors, but these are the guys who are doing all the actual skill and labor. And so we thought it was really interesting to see this and to try to figure out how are we going to name these guys? How are we going to find out who all these gentlemen are? There's 21 guys in this picture, and it's like, that's a lot of people. That's a lot of skill. And so, so like I said, this is the golden photo. And so how are we going to do that? So this is dated 1935. And we were kind of stumped at first of how to move on with this. And then, so the first thing you're going to do is form a committee, of course. So we formed a committee last summer, and we decided even with like our Black History Month programming that's going on right now, it was all hands on deck. We have people from all different departments all over the museum who are dedicated to solving these questions and these mysteries. So as you can see from this list, this is all of us who are working on this project. And some people have different focuses that they're working on. I'll tell you, Cindy Verser is the queen of research. She can dive into newspapers.com like there's no tomorrow. But there's a lot of stuff to go through to try to find the stories and that maritime information, that those stories that we need from all those folks. Now, I mentioned newspapers.com. So that's one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to start searching through databases. So newspapers.com is an excellent resource. If you haven't used that, if you do any kind of genealogy, it's just a treasure trove of information. You can find obituaries that way. You can find crime reports, you can find awards given, you can find businesses purchased, you can research businesses that are listed as occupations. When it's just a title of a company, you can find them that way. So newspapers.com is a great resource. Of course, ancestry.com, because you can find all the census reports, a lot of the registering for the draft, all that kind of information is there, marriages, deaths, babies being born, all that kind of information is on ancestry.com. And then of course, archives at the museum specifically, where we're going through paperwork, and I'm going to show you a little bit in a few minutes of that, because there's also quite a few letters from the time period of the construction of the museum, receipts, contracts, things like that. Military records, some of these folks did serve in the military, or at least were, like I said, registering for the draft. And there's a great room called the Virginia Room at the Newport News Library on Main Street. Normally, we would be there doing research. Unfortunately, right now, it is closed to the public because of the pandemic. But as soon as I can get back in there, I will be there. And of course, our biggest resource, which is why we're doing this program today, is our community. A lot of these folks were from right here, and maybe that your family, and like right over to the community, to the other section, you can see maybe your family's been here for generations. Maybe your family lived in this area in the early 20th century and then moved because of the war, because of business changing, because of family changes. Maybe you have family or really close friends who worked at the shipyard that you know and you could talk to. Maybe you're the one who inherited all the family photos. I have a lot of the family photos from my family, from both sides of my family. And, you know, they're really interesting to go through and see who you can recognize. And that's another reason why we're doing this now. As an example, I'll use my mom as an example. My mom is just about to turn 86. So she was actually born in 1935. So she could probably look back at a photo and pick out her dad at 20, 25 years old. Now, me looking at that same photo, I may or may not be able to pick out my grandfather. So we're getting into a generation that we really need their help as they, you know, hit the end of their years, but we need their help to be able to recognize a lot of these family members. Now, you might also belong to community organizations or business organizations, or maybe a church who's been in the area for quite a while, and that's another really good resource. And you really, you know, genealogy can be basically like a treasure hunt, a scavenger hunt, where you're finding out some really cool information. And that's what we're trying to find. We want the stories of these families who dedicated so much time to the Mariners Museum and their community. Merry Christmas to us. One of our amazing archives staff members, Bill Barker, he's one of the archivists for the Mariners Museum. He found the photo with the names, last names, but the last names marked, and we were so excited. This was like Christmas, let me tell you. It was over the Christmas holiday. I sent an email out to everybody like, oh my gosh, guess what we found? And so we were really excited to find this because this really gives so much information to see who these guys are. Now, I will tell you that you can't necessarily go by the spellings on this or even necessarily if there's a first initial on it, because that isn't necessarily going to be correct. Now, some of the names, like for instance, Diggs and Spratley, are very common in this area. So if this person was named like John Spratley, for instance, there are several John Spratleys in this area historically. But this was a huge, huge find for us. And it helped us start to really feel like we could make some progress. Now I will show you that these are the 4 gentlemen that we know for sure exactly who they are. We have found records for these gentlemen, so we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. So you can see Mr. McKinley Banks, you can see Mr. Haywood Roy. Now, and I will tell you that in the museum records, his name is spelled with an E. It's actually an A. Mr. James Scott is one of the brick masons, and then Mr. Willie Griffin. So we know these guys for sure. Now, I will say that I did speak with someone in December, and they had identified the gentleman who's the 6th from the left, this gentleman here, as a different person than what our records have. So that one's kind of he's in limbo right now. We're not exactly permanently sure which guy he is in the story. But I want to tell you a little bit about Mr. Willie Griffin, after he worked as a laborer doing work at the museum, he actually was hired on staff and became part of the janitorial department at the Mariners Museum. Now, you know, that's a name that's probably a little easier to search. So Cindy Verser was able to find some more information about him. And this is one of the things that we do all the time is we hit up ancestry.com. And so we were able to find his registration card with his information as to where he was actually living at the time, with his exact birth date and all that information, which is great. This is the census record, and it shows where he was living with his wife, Virginia, and his 2 children. And so that gives us some more information about him. And then more of this description of the registrar's paperwork. So there's more information here about him as well. So that gives us a framework, but that doesn't really tell us the story. Now, we would love to find maybe grandchildren who remember him to get those stories about what kind of guy he was, because that would be fun to know. Now, Mr. Haywood Roy, I'll tell you, in our paperwork, his last name is spelled different. I mean, his first name is spelled differently. So we did a little more digging and found the correct spelling for his name. He was also hired back on as the janitorial staff, so he worked at the museum. Now, I will tell you that we think this is his grandchild, or who got married at age 17 to his bride who was 16. So there's a story there, I'm sure. But we're able to also see that, you know, Hilton Village is considered its own city at that time, like a little sub-city of Newport News, which is interesting. I found his death certificate as well. I blocked out his cause of death because if you want to know, you can look it up. But I didn't think we really needed to see that here. But I like that his kind of business or industry, you can see the Mariners Museum is listed on his death certificate. And here's his grave. And he and his wife Pearl are buried in Newport News. And I didn't realize that there's actually an African-American cemetery very close to where we are at the Mariners Museum. It's across the street and kind of behind, it's back in that neighborhood behind the dorm, CNU dorm that has Panera and that whole string of shops in it. It's back behind in there. There's a cemetery, and I'm hoping once the weather warms up that I can go and pay my respects, because he did a lot of work for the museum, which is very cool. So I have to tell you, before we start with this one, I have this great quote from Cindy. When we first started the program, when we found some of the names, I kept getting pinged, getting emails, and it was like 7:30, 8 o'clock at night. And I was like, Cindy, you need to stop working for a while and have some dinner. And she responded with, can't stop now, hitting the mother lode, and it may not be there tomorrow. These men and women need to be found and want to be found. Names are jumping off the pages. Pulled a census record for one guy and found 2 others on the same page. It's really cool putting stories with the faces. Found out that this guy, Willie, who was in the previous picture, was definitely a shipyard employee as a pipe fitter after he left the Mariners Museum, wondering if some of the men were shipyard employees who had dual employment with the museum and the yard, like the model builders. Willie's son worked at the yard as a laborer. His daughter married a sailor when she was 16, which is kind of interesting. Now, I will tell you that there were actually 3,000 Black employees at Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock at this time period, which is kind of cool to see. Now, this one is really interesting because we knew the names of these 2 gentlemen. They are brick masons, and I'm sure when they were actually doing this job, they were just like quaking in their shoes, because this is a really strange technique for building brick walls, and it's known as the Huntington squeeze, because Archer Huntington, who founded the museum, was very fond of this style where the mortar just kind of sticks out and squishes like that. Just about every museum that he had his hand in, including Brook Green Gardens, has this technique. So I'm sure that this made brick masons just crazy because they weren't swiping off all that squishy mortar. They were leaving it there to dry. And you can still see this today at the Mariners Museum. It is still like this today. Now, these two gentlemen, I used this in a blog, and then it got used by in an article by the Daily Press. And I ended up having a phone call meeting with well, actually, it was a Zoom call with McKinley Banks's granddaughter. How awesome is that? She saw the article in the newspaper, and she actually said, "It's Daddy May." And that's what I love that. That's the kind of stories we're looking for. So Mr. McKinley Banks was her grandfather, and they called him Daddy May. And she had wonderful stories about him, that he had a great sense of humor. He was very loving. And then she went on and told us stories about how Huntington High School, which is where she attended, used to visit the museum on Easter Monday and go to the museum inside and spend time in the park. And these are lovely stories connecting us to the community. So that's the kind of stories we would love to hear. But it was so great. She was so excited to see this picture of him, which I just love. I use this picture for a lot of different things. Now, just in case you couldn't see it on that image, these are the names on the image of the 21 gentlemen who worked at the museum. So if you see a name that you think sounds a little familiar, believe it or not, there are a lot of red crosses. I never would have guessed that, but there are quite a few. I did some research. We do think we might have some information on Mr. Wooten, but some of these are just hard, like a last name like Brown and Wilson, East, Moore. Those are going to be hard names to track. So if you have any information, we would gladly appreciate some help with that. Now, this is another kind of thing you see in the corporate archives. This is these are 3 pages that are bound together. As you can see, they're numbered at the bottom. And these are all Black workers at the Mariners Museum. Now, the problem you can see, look at all the number of Johnsons that we have working at the museum, and there's just a first initial. So that, and like I said before, first initials can be wrong. So it's really hard to track some of these folks and figure out who they actually are. You can see their start date for employment, and you can see the day that they were dropped from employment. And you can see that one gentleman, Carter Merrow, actually died in 1934. That's right there on the sheet. So this is a little bit earlier when things were just starting to happen at the museum and the property. Now, these 2 gentlemen, we do have their information. Mr. Elmo Jordan worked as the janitor, and also Mr. Alexander Pressey. Now, Mr. Pressey died just shortly after this. This was taken in 1944, and he died about 2 years later. And there is a Jordan in some of the documents, but this is not the same gentleman, so it's not the same guy. I looked very closely with a magnifying glass comparing their faces. Now, the thing with this program too is we're just starting with the people who built our museum. We are delving into the collection. We're also updating language and terminology in our collection. Some of that work has been done by our archival staff, but there's so much more to do because we do have a huge collection, and really there's only about 100 employees at the Mariners Museum total. So we have this huge collection, but we're just starting with our immediate community with identifying photos. We'll start branching out as we go, as we get a little bit more success and more of that information. This is another one of my favorite images in the collection. So this one is great because this is actually fishermen pulling nets off the coast of Virginia. This photo is from 1948. So that, it's really, really important because we're just starting with this close to home section of photographs. And because we want to honor them. We want to honor the work that they did. And then we want to share all of this information with our community so we can better tell that story. Now I will show you this. This is my absolute favorite photo in the entire collection. I love this photo. These are two sailors, United States Navy sailors in front of the USS Mason in the Boston Navy Yard. You can tell that they like a good time. They obviously just had a big snowball fight, and there they are standing there. I'd love to have them over for dinner. That's just awesome. And of course, the USS Mason was the first predominantly African-American crew, but we don't know who they are. We don't know their names. And wouldn't you love to come across a photo of your family and see a lot of these are men, I will say, see your grandfather smiling and happy, see your dad as a young man. It would just be so wonderful to see that and to identify them. This is another great one. This is two sailors in dress whites, and you can see them playing musical instruments. And but again, we don't know who they are. Now, some of these have been identified, and we've gotten funding for pulling them out of the collection by the Hidden Collections Grant from the Council on Library and Information, but we still don't know who they are. So we're trying to get this information out, and I will have a blog post posted this week as well with these images, so you'll be able to easily share them with anyone that you can think of. Now, lest you think it's all men, I have to show you this great image. This is a really interesting photo. It's dated April 4th, 1944. And this is a situation where this one might be a little bit easier to identify. Now, the gentleman in the center is named Glenn T. Settle from Cleveland, Ohio. And he's actually the director of a chorus of 10 men, 10 women, all African American, and they're waiting at the point of embarkation in Newport News to get on board the USS West Point to entertain the troops. Now, so they might be a little easier to identify because of military records, but we don't have them identified in the collection. So that's another project to work on. Now, this is kind of our intro to this program. Now, I want to tell you that this is also going to be a series. So as we learn more, as we find more images from our collection, as we gain more knowledge about what we're looking for, we're going to be reaching out to the community to see if you can help us. This is kind of, you know, something new for museums to do. We are not the all-knowing people. We need our communities, and because you have the knowledge, you have the family history and the knowledge. So I just want to see if anyone has any questions. If you want to see any of the images again while we're right here, we can do that. I would love to answer anything.
Lauren, we have a question about the image background.
Oh, this is my second favorite image in the collection. And I will tell you that this one is another Thomas Skinner painting. And I wrote down what this one is. Let me see. Oh, this is the Forge Hammer Shop in 1942. And it's just another huge 10-foot by 6-foot painting that Thomas Skinner did. Here's more information if you want to check out any more of our programming that's going to be coming on. I just wanted to give you some links for that. And then I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen, unless someone wants to see another, let's see, I'm actually seeing these, let's see. Oh, that's a really good question. Someone asked payroll information about the African-American workers who built the museum. That would be a really interesting thing to know. I don't think we have payroll records. Some records weren't actually kept, which is kind of crazy to think about. But we don't have all of that information, I hate to say. Sarah said, do you know what ages the workers were and how long they worked to build the museum? It looks like some of them were only on staff for as short as 6 months and as long as a couple of years, who were actually doing construction work at the museum. Look, if you look at the pictures, some of them look like they were pretty young. They could have been late teens up into their 20s, and then a couple of older gentlemen. But McKinley Banks is interesting because at the time that that photo was taken, soon after that, he was no longer married and he was living with his brother. And then I saw a new marriage license. So he then remarried. But it's just interesting going through and seeing all the family information. So I also had a good question on about how many items. So right now, we have about 10 photos, and that one with all the, as soon as we can identify everyone in that main photo and make sure we've got the initials correct, so we find the right people in that photo, we will expand from there. Because once we have those guys identified, we can look at some of those construction photos where you see them pouring cement and doing that kind of work and match up who's who in these photos. And that's a priority for us to do that. I'm gonna have to check on that payroll question because I'm really interested in that too. Any other questions? It's very, very quiet. And I'm hoping to get the blog posted tomorrow morning, just so you know. I'm sorry, I'm reading some of the chat conversation. And yes, just so you know, all of these programs that we're doing for Black History Month, other than Maritime Mondays, they're all recorded and on our YouTube channel so that you can watch them there. Maritime Mondays cannot be recorded because of copyright issues for the books. So you just have to catch those programs as they happen.
All right, looks like that's all the questions that we have today.
Okay, awesome. I so appreciate everyone being here. Thank you so much. Thank you for being interested in this idea and this program. And my contact information, let me see, I'm gonna put my email address in the chat. If I can spell. And please reach out to me. I would love to talk to you if you have any leads. Maybe you have a different source, an additional source for doing research. I would love to talk to you about that. Oh, there's another one here. Yeah, public records would be good too, car registration, things like that. We have run across a couple of the folks who did not read or write, so that's interesting too. And one father that we think is one of the guys, he all his children went all the way through high school. He had about 5 kids, and all of them went all the way through high school, and he did not read or write, which is interesting. So Mark Whitaker, I don't know about the payroll. I don't think we have payroll information. Um, it might be in a different archive, but that is something I'm going to talk to one of our archivists next week when I have to come into the museum for another meeting. But thank you for that suggestion, because I'm interested in that as well. Um, And someone asked how many people are online today, and I'm not sure what that's in reference to. That's in this program or just basically, um, I'm not sure what that is in reference to.
I think he might mean how many are on the
Oh, how many are
program today,
attending
and
this
I-
lecture?
Yeah, and I think at the height, we had 40.
Okay. So that's good. That's a start. You know, and a lot of times there's more than one person watching too. When you register, you've got retired folks who are watching together. So that's hopeful. That's a lot of information out there. That's 40 people who can reach out to their community and come up with more ideas for us, because I would appreciate the help.
And Steve Cohen asks, what about tax records? Is that a way that we might be able to find some information?
That's a good idea. I'm not sure what kind of access we have to that, but I will, I'm making a note. Good idea. All right. Right, property ownership and tax records are public, that's true. And I did find some information too in the census about, you know, ownership, whether they own their own house or if they're renters. So that's good information as well. Okay. I think things are slowing down a little bit now in the chat. All right. Any other questions? And like I said, please email me if you think of something or someone even specifically that I could reach out to. You know, we don't call them sinkholes in our department. I mean, excuse me, we don't call them rabbit holes in our department. We call them sinkholes because it's not like, you know, rabbit hole, you can kind of choose to fall down it or not, but a sinkhole kind of just kind of gives way underneath you. And that's kind of the way ancestry.com it gets, because you just start looking and looking and one thing leads to another. And then you find maybe one little section of the family and you're trying to pull that thread back to the main family. And it's just always so interesting to read. And then you end up going on to newspapers.com to see articles that were written where people are referenced, and like one employer, I didn't know what it was. And then I searched on newspapers.com and discovered that it was a concrete company that also did septic tanks. It's like, okay, well, that explains that. So it's just really an interesting process. And they're just such important stories to get these known. Okay. Well, Sherry, I think that might be everything.
Right, I don't have any more comments in the chat box or questions in the Q&A box.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for being here today. I so appreciate your support. please look at our website, marinersmuseum.org, for more programming that's going on. And we would love to have you join us on all of our programming this month. And again, like I said, I'll get that blog up as soon as possible.